Hello and welcome to another episode of the Dongfang Hour China Aerospace and Space News Roundup. This is the first episode of the month of March that is not a quarantine episode. I'm Blaine Curcio, joined as always by my co-host Jean Deville. Before getting into the episode this week, I would like to send a special shout out to our good friends at spacewatch.global and at Go Taikonauts, two great sources of space industry news and two of the reasons that I was able to stay as sane as I did over the last few weeks. Big thanks to both of them for organizing a couple of calls and Zoom events. So this week, the week of the 15th to 21st of March, we bring you a few updates from the industry. We will discuss a large investment into the CASICloud business of CASIC. We will discuss a Ka-band phased array antenna, but first, Jean will bring us some updates from Hunan-based nanosatellite manufacturer Hangsheng Satellite.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are honored to welcome you aboard the Dongfang Hour. Please make sure your seatbelt is securely fastened. Thank you.
士们、先生们，预计空中飞行时间2小时15分钟，我们预计在当地时间下午6点25分左右到达。
First update this week is about a lesser-known company, a Chinese new space company called Hangsheng, a nanosatellite manufacturer. And this news comes to us from the Changsha Evening News, so definitely a very local newspaper from the city of Changsha, Changsha being the capital of Hunan province in central China. Changsha is actually a city that has quite some new space industry. When you look at it, there's a cluster of companies and names that you probably already know that are all based in Changsha, such as Space-T, Spacetube, Maxwell, Lanyue, and of course Hangsheng, which is the company we're talking about today. And this cluster, I think to some extent, is probably due to the fact that the NUDT is based in Changsha, NUDT being the National University of Defense Technology, which has a lot of activities in space and historically has formed a lot of the the space engineering people and the Chinese space leadership. And now back to Hangsheng. Hangsheng was founded in 2015. Part of the core team indeed came from NUDT. And according to their website, basically this company does two things. One is satellite subsystems manufacturing. It's mostly mechanical systems such as torque systems and reaction wheels. And they also have a second business line, which is building nanosatellites. And from what I understand and from my observations over the past years, Hangsheng has been mostly focused on the subsystem part of their activity and not much on the satellite manufacturing. At least there are not many sales that I know of. And this is as opposed to, say, their local competitor, Space-T, also in Changsha, that has launched dozens of satellites since they were founded. And so now back to the Changsha Evening News. The Changsha Evening people, they managed to send a journalist to the facilities of Hangsheng Satellite, and so they reported about what was going on. And basically, they said that there was a Hangsheng-1, a 37-kilogram satellite that was in the final phases of testing, and that would be launched in next month. And this satellite would have on board, so I'm just quoting them here, it would be carrying scientific and technical experimental payloads. That doesn't really say anything about if this satellite was actually commercialized or if it's just internal equipment that's being tested by Hangsheng. But I think the main takeaway from the Changsha Evening News here is that, I think Hangsheng, it gives us a better picture of what Hangsheng Satellite is doing, and it does seem that they are taking their satellite manufacturing business line seriously, since the satellite is actually being made and it's going to be launched next month. And another thing that's interesting to mention here is on the Hangsheng website, you have this constellation called Lexiang, which is a 12 satellite constellation in three different planes that does remote sensing and narrowband communication, so AIS notably and ADS-B. And this constellation's been on there for really quite some time. There's been no real updates on it as far as I know. But the fact that they're actually building a satellite today, that's a good sign for this constellation. And also the fact that the Changsha Evening News, they also asked Hangsheng about this, and they confirmed that they were still planning this 12 satellite constellation. So that's rather a good sign for the Lexiang constellation as well. And last thing also, just relating a little bit to the satellite manufacturing business of Hangsheng, in August 2020, we maybe reported about this in the Dongfang Hour Weekly News. They signed a cooperation agreement with a company called Zhong'an Guotong, which is based in Shenzhen. And this was to probably, I remember, if I remember correctly, was to build satellites for a 12 to 15 satellite Earth observation constellation, which would be deployed by 2022. I mean, again, this Zhong'an Guotong, this has been an extremely stealthy constellation, but I think it's it's another piece of news that suggests that Hangsheng is really investing into their satellite manufacturing line. So that's good to know, and just another satellite manufacturer in the new space landscape of China.
Indeed, and just to follow up on the Zhong'an Guotong article from a couple of months ago, it was one of those kind of only in China things when rereading that article and seeing them talk about how the original satellite, was a 40th birthday present for the city of Shenzhen, which of course turned 40 in, I guess, 2019, and how the constellation was kind of the first. So despite being a birthday present for the city, it was apparently the first commercial satellite of some specific kind, or something where it was both a municipal project apparently and a commercial thing. So one of those only in China moments, I suppose. Just a couple of other points to add about Hangsheng. So this is a little bit speculation from my side, but I would venture to say they may be one of the more kind of defense focused, or at least like sort of government-focused small satellite manufacturers in China, just based on their affiliation with the National University of Defense Technology, and also just the extent to which they're very much kind of flying under the radar. They're affiliated with a couple of other universities like the HIT that are also quite close to the let's say the establishment in China. So it's certainly interesting to see them now being a bit more public and a bit more they're on the Changsha Evening News, which I suppose maybe is the. Would that be on Hunan Television, or are you supposed it's a separate channel like Changsha TV, something like this?
I have no idea.
But Hunan TV, I believe we spoke about that in another episode. But digressing, I think one last point to mention about Changsha is just the location is quite. It's interesting in the sense that it's about it's a bit more than so between Shenzhen and Guangzhou. So Shenzhen, Guangzhou in the south, which are about Guangzhou is maybe an hour and a half south of Changsha by high-speed rail. And then going north from Changsha, you have Wuhan, which is maybe an hour and a half, 2 hours away. So it's really this, I guess, certainly lower cost than, say, both Wuhan and Guangzhou, although Wuhan is certainly lower cost than Guangzhou. But so it's a sort of lower cost, but still quite innovative city with a lot of companies that are doing interesting things. In addition to the ones that you mentioned, we've also seen companies like Sanyi, which is a sort of heavy machinery manufacturer. And we've also, I think, seen a lot of provincial level support for the space sector. I believe we would have mentioned on previous episodes Xu Dazhe, who was the former governor and I believe now party secretary of Hunan province, who's a former CNSA, possibly the head of the CNSA. And he would have been quite instrumental, I think, in bringing the China Space Day conference from 2019 to Changsha. So again, just this whole kind of interplay of commercial companies and universities and the provincial government, and in some cases the municipal government. A lot of interesting things happening and a lot of pretty big actors that have a lot of ability for job creation. So again, Changsha being a rapidly growing, but nonetheless, we could call it sort of second tier Chinese space city. And to transition to another sort of second-tier Chinese space city, which is certainly bigger than Changsha, a bit more international, but still not as big of a city as, say, Beijing or Shanghai or Shenzhen in the context of space, we have Chengdu. And our second news update of the week is coming out of Chengdu. It is from a company called Starwin, which some of you may have heard of. Starwin is one of the more innovative ground terminal manufacturers in China. And the news this week is that they have announced a test in a partnership with China Satcom for a Ka-band electronically steered phased array antenna. And this comes about a week after Starwin had released a promo video for its Ka-band electronically steered phased array antenna, which included a pretty cool LinkedIn post and again a video that was quite really nice. It was a nice Audi SUV driving through what looked like the mountains of Sichuan province with some very relaxing music in the background with this electronic antenna on top that was quite a flat antenna. And I did a little bit more digging on Starwin's LinkedIn page, and they have a couple more similar videos from just the last week of some of their they call them rapid assembly or mini portable Ku band antenna where they have a whole team assembling these antennas within 40 seconds. So a lot of innovation in the last week or so being announced or being sort of promoted by Starwin. And it really, I think it's indicative of a bigger trend that we're starting to see in China. And it's indicative of the very interesting position that Starwin is in right now. And what we've really seen, I guess, is, over the last 5 or 10 years globally, the SATCOM industry, the satellite communications industry, has undergone some pretty major changes. So most notably, this idea of having what are called high throughput satellites being launched. And so this is a satellite that would have typically 10 times or sometimes like 100 times the capacity of a traditional satellite, but for not that much more in terms of CapEx cost. So the result is that you have vastly cheaper satellite capacity being put into orbit. And this has occurred in a lot of Western countries. And we've seen high throughput satellites launched in the US and in Western Europe, in parts of Asia Pacific. In China, we've seen relatively less. And this is, I guess, for a couple of reasons that we've not seen as much capacity coming online in China. The first one is that the country has a relatively strong terrestrial network. And so this has led to the perception that you don't really need to have a lot of satellite capacity. The second element is that China Satcom, the local satellite operator, has what you could pretty generously call a duopoly in the market with APT Satellite, which is a China Satcom subsidiary, or you could also reasonably call it a monopoly. But essentially, China Satcom has had a pretty good business of satellite broadcast and serving government clients. And so you've really not had as much of a need to deploy high throughput satellite capacity in China as you have in the rest of the world. And I would point out this is not necessarily unique in China. If we look at Japan and South Korea, their two national satellite operators, JSAT and KTSat, have also been relatively slow to deploy HTS capacity, and for similar reasons, although JSAT now has a couple of HTS payloads. But digressing, in China now we are starting to see high throughput capacity being launched. This first started in 2016 with ChinaSat 16, might have been 2017. I need to double check on that. But either way, the first high throughput satellite from ChinaSat was ChinaSat 16, Ka-band capacity, a relatively small high throughput satellite, but nonetheless, it was a more capacity than they previously had. We saw them try to launch a second one in 2019, ChinaSat 18, although that satellite failed. And more recently, we have seen APT Mobile Satcom of Shenzhen launch APStar 6D, which is a Ku-band HTS. And so we're starting to see in China, more HTS capacity coming into the market. We've also seen China Satcom order several HTS satellites to be launched in the next few years, which are going to have coverage of the Pacific region more broadly and also sort of Central Asia. And so you're starting to see China catch up to the rest of the world in this sort of trend of launching a lot more satellite capacity. And the one other element of this that I think is important to consider is the Guolong low Earth orbit constellation, which we mentioned in last week's Dongfang Hour, because that's going to represent a lot more high throughput capacity in low Earth orbit. So you're going to have just a huge increase in the amount of satellite capacity that is launched by China. And so now the missing link here is going to be having a ground terminal that is usable, that is it's cost effective, that can be built in very large quantities. And this is where companies like Starwin are coming in and playing a very important role. And again, if we look at the West and if we look at the sort of several years ahead that the West is in Satcom, they have companies like Isotropic System and Chimeta and Alcon Systems, among others, that are building antennas for GEO or LEO or MEO. And we're really in the West starting to see the market size expand dramatically. So, for example, in late 2020, there were reports that Starlink, which is SpaceX's constellation, had paid $2.4 billion for 1 million terminals. And there's a paywalled article on Business Insider, but there's a Reddit link that has the report summary, so we can include that. But yeah, basically, we're getting to the point where you're getting 1 million terminals ordered in the West because there's that much bandwidth being put into orbit. And so again, getting back to China, we have a situation where China is a few years behind, but they are starting to launch a lot of capacity. And so you're going to have companies like Starwin and a couple of others that I think Sean's going to mention here in a moment that are really going to need to create a large number of relatively cheap antennas to make use of these just tons and tons of gigabits per second that are being launched. And I would just make one final point that Starwin in particular has been known to be collaborating with CETC, which is a fellow, they have a lot of Chengdu-based subsidiaries to CETC. And we've seen, just photos of the Starwin team at CETC and the like. And CETC being the key integrator for the Tiandi Yitihua, the sort of sky and earth integration mega project. This would seem to indicate that Starwin may have a role to play there as well. But again, that's not to say they're the only one. So Sean, anything to add on Starwin or any discussion on the other companies doing similar things in China?
Yeah, I think it's really fascinating to watch this race from Chinese companies to build these affordable electronically steered phased array antennas and terminals, and so definitely Starwin is one of them and one of the most advanced. I'd like to add that there are others, and I guess there's different applications as well for these different terminals, right? So CTC, for example, based in Chengdu, they unveiled, I think it was at the Zhuhai Air Show in 2018, a similar flat panel antenna that's dedicated to IFC, so that would be put on the fuselage of an aircraft. I think there's also a company called Tianrui Xingchen, and they're also, I think, focused on IFC. So it's also domes to be put on an aircraft. And we also have several other Chinese companies also working on phased array antennas, such as SatPro, for example. I think they're also marketing phased array antenna on their website. So yeah, there definitely is this race to get to these terminals in different verticals and at an affordable price. And just by mentioning these companies, another thought that comes to mind is all these companies that I just mentioned, except SatPro, they're all in Chengdu. Tianrui, CTC, Starwin, and this really points to Chengdu as this hot area for antennas in China. And if I remember correctly, during episode 7 of Dongfang Hour, when we had Donglu from CONSAT on board, they also mentioned that they had created a subsidiary dedicated to telecom terminals in Yibin. So Yibin is not in Chengdu per se, but it is 150 kilometers or 200 kilometers away from Chengdu in Sichuan province. So probably the human resources would be coming from Chengdu, and there would be close links to Chengdu as well. So Sichuan province, definitely a big place for antennas, I think. And so maybe Changsha is a powerhouse for Chinese new space with all the companies we mentioned previously. I think Chengdu is definitely another one of those cities with with a specialization in antennas among other things.
For sure. I've heard there's some other stuff going on in Wuhan as well.
Oh yeah, I think so. Speaking of Wuhan,
you want to take us into Wuhan and what's going on there?
All right, then. Moving on to our next point now, linked to Wuhan is CASICloud. That's our last piece of news for today. CASICloud, they announced this week that they raised 2.63 billion with a B RMB in a new round of funding. And so 2.63 billion, I looked this up previously, that's about $400 million US. So that's really a huge amount of funding. Now, CASICloud admittedly is not really a space company or a space-related company, although there are links to space, and we'll see that in a few minutes. But it is, their parent company is CASIC, this huge defense contractor, which does have some activities in space. And so CASICloud is a subsidiary of CASIC that's dedicated to the industrial internet. It was launched in 2015. And this is at the same time as China kicked off the Made in China 2025 policy, which sort of follows up this concept that was pushed forward by Germany in 2012, which was called Industry 4.0, and also theorized by the US in 2014, called the Industrial Internet. And the idea here is really from the Made in China 2025 policies to make China a leader in 10 strategic sectors that are key to manufacturing by 2025. And the first on that list is, quoting here, information technology, including AI and IoT. So really CASICloud is at the core of this first item here. And I think CASICloud to some extent can be seen as an implementation of from CASIC of the Made in China 2025 policy. And I think also it's interesting for the central government to have CASICloud, a state-owned company, have some activities in the cloud business. Because if you look at who's in charge of the cloud business right now in China, the big players are Tencent Cloud and AliCloud, and these are all privately owned companies. So for something as strategic as the cloud infrastructure, it's nice to have CASICloud also have a foot in there. And speaking of AliCloud and Tencent Cloud, I actually think that CASICloud shouldn't be directly compared to these two players, because while CASICloud does have a cloud infrastructure component to their business, I think what they're selling more and putting forward more is this industrial software suite that's dedicated to the various industries. And so in that sense, they're more comparable to Siemens, for example, or General Electric, which have their equivalent software suite. And so it'd be software that's dedicated to, say, predictive maintenance, to machine-to-machine communications, this sort of thing. And this actually is really apparent when you look at the client pool of CASICloud. It's huge traditional industries like Sinopec, so that's oil and gas. And you also have traditional manufacturing industries. And you also have Chinese industrial parks. And so you have nothing of what seems to be, a big part of maybe AliCloud or Tencent Cloud's business, which is, say, B2C e-commerce, maybe it's Netflix like streaming, this sort of stuff. So very different clients between CASICloud and Tencent and Ali. And last point maybe here on CASICloud, or just CASIC's more generally their industrial internet policy. They also have a space component to it, because they are developing a constellation called Hangsheng-1, based in Wuhan, and which is planning to deploy 12 satellites into orbit as early as this year, by the end of this year. So yeah, a very active industrial intranet policy coming from CASIC. And I think that while they are much smaller than, say, in Tencent or Ali, I think they're definitely a company that's going to grow in that business, because that is really the one of the upcoming trends of the next decade, and as was foreseen by Made in China 2025.
Yeah, and so just a couple of things to add to that. So I think it's a good point of the sort of the distinction between let's call it the value proposition of CASICloud versus a Tencent Cloud or an Ali Cloud, in the sense that again, you could imagine a Sinopec type of company preferring to, in some cases, buy their cloud services from a fellow state-owned company. And even if it's not necessarily Sinopec that prefers that, it could be the sort of the CASAC type of organization above Sinopec that might be making some of those decisions for, say, highly sensitive data. So it's certainly, it's interesting that CASIC, of all of the, say, 100 very large SOEs that have some degree of, say, science and technology and this sort of thing in what they do, that CASIC is saying, why not us to do this industrial IoT is interesting. But yeah, so a couple of other points. The amount of money is significant. 400 million is a lot of money. What is also significant, I think, is the where this money is coming from. So just to unpack this a little bit, some of our listeners may or may not have heard of ICBC, which is the lead investor, or ICBC Capital. And so basically ICBC, the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China, they are, again, the leading investor, and they are according to the Forbes Global 2000, they are the largest company in the world. And this is when ranked by a combination of market capitalization, assets, sales, and profit. And for 8 years in a row, they have been the number one company. So they had 2020 assets of $4.3 trillion US dollars, sales of 177 billion, profits of 43 billion, and a market cap of 242 billion. So this is a huge, huge company that is leading this investment, or I should say the sort of venture capital arm of this huge, huge, huge company. And then I guess looking a little bit further down the list at the second largest, or at least the second named participant in this round of funding, it is also a top 30 company on this Global 2000 list. So you have China Merchants Capital, which is the VC arm of China Merchants Bank, which is the number 26 company on the Forbes 2000 in the year 2020. So basically you have two of the 30 largest companies in the world by this, one of many possible methodologies for ranking companies, but still it's a methodology by a fairly, known organization. It's not bad. And it's certainly an indication, I think, of the level of support, because both ICBC and China Merchants are again, they are state-owned and they're huge banks. I guess another point to expand upon a little bit is the presence of CASICloud in Germany and potentially other EU countries. So I found a website. So basically CASICloud, they seem to be marketed in the West under the name Indix, so INDICS. And I found the company's German website, such as www.indix.de. And as you mentioned, John, it mentions Siemens as a partner, probably from that 2017 MOU or contract. But you also had German software giant, I guess SAP, although I never know if it's SAP or SAP, but SAP. And then you had engineering giant Bosch, another very large German company. Another partner was Sanyi, taking us back to the Changsha connection there. But digressing, I think the last point that I would mention is, I guess, the likelihood of CASIC's Xingyun constellation, which you mentioned earlier, and the extent to which it is related to their industrial IoT. So I think there's an important distinction here between Xingyun and Hongyun and Hongyan, which were the three sort of large-ish state-owned constellations that we had heard publicly announced, which was all kind of thrown into question about a week and a half ago when we saw Guowang formally announced, which we discussed in our last episode. And when Guowang was formally announced, and even before that, you'd had some expectation that 2 or 3 of these existing constellations would be rolled into Guowang. And my suspicion, and I think this is a generally held belief among the Chinese space industry, is that Xingyun and let's say Guowang or Hongyun and Hongyan, these are 2 relatively separate value propositions, insofar as Xingyun is seen as sort of the iridium of China, as it were, and Guowang or Hongyun, Hongyan, or whoever else is more the Starlink of China. And I think if we consider, iridium is a relatively old business. I mean, the first generation of iridium satellites were launched in like the early 2000s, and they now have their second generation like well into service now, and it's a $5 billion market cap company with a relatively proven business model, and it's sort of narrowband basically narrowband and relatively far fewer satellites required than, say, a Starlink. And so I think in the Chinese context, it is reasonable to expect that you'd have a situation where a Xingyun could be deployed independently of a Guowang or Hongyun Hongyan combination, whatever it would be. And so you would have a sort of narrowband Chinese iridium that could be deployed as early as 2023, perhaps, in its entirety. And then you might have a Guowang that's a much, much larger constellation of thousands or tens of thousands that might not be deployed for a rather longer time frame. But again, I do think that when you look at the sort of the alleged and seemingly legitimate satellite manufacturing capabilities of CASIC and of Space Engineering Development Company, their subsidiary in Wuhan, where they have, again, CASIC has said that they've completed this factory that has a production capacity of more than 100 small satellites per year, with that being 100 kilogram satellites. If you look at Xingyun, this is like an 80 satellite constellation. So this is not a huge amount for that type of capacity. So yeah, I do think that this sort of implicit endorsement this explicit endorsement, as it were, of CASICloud, it should also be good news for Xingyun in the sense that it clearly shows importance for the IIoT concept. And I do think a Chinese iridium is a rather separate value proposition from a Chinese Starlink, as it were. So yeah, anything else from your end, John, on Changsha, Wuhan, Chengdu, Fuzhou, Jiangxi?
I'm all good on these cities.
All right. Well, I'm focused on getting out of, now that I'm out of quarantine, it's like, man, I just want to go exploring. But anyway, this has been another episode of the Dongfang Hour China Aerospace and Space News Roundup. This for the week of the 15th to 21st of March. I'm Blaine Curcio, joined as always by my co-host, Jean Deville, and we will see you next time. And don't forget, coming next month, we will have our new long-form episode with the Secure World Foundation and Kalis Foundation to discuss their U.S. perceptions of Chinese commercial space report, which was released a couple of months ago. So yeah, be on the lookout for more information about that. We will be coming in next month with that episode. Thank you for listening, and have a good night.
Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.